Unit 3, Reasonable Adjustments. Hello, lovely to meet you. I'm Christina Welsh and I work for the Council for Disabled Children. If you haven't yet watched the introduction video, please find the link in the text below as it will provide a guide as to how to approach the 4 units in this training series. This third unit considers what reasonable adjustments are under the Equality Act and why they are so important. You may already be familiar with reasonable adjustments, or you may be putting some in place without even realising. Disabled children may need to have individual reasonable adjustments put in place so they can participate fully in their early education. There are other examples of reasonable adjustments that would be important for a disabled child, but that many children in the setting may benefit from. We'll go into the different types of reasonable adjustments that the Equality Act sets out and provide more detail on them later. We'll do a short activity at the beginning of the training to get you warmed up and set the scene for the training. We'll also encourage you to think about a case study and what reasonable adjustments you may put in place for that particular child. Think about what adjustments you personally made for a child to help them participate more easily in an activity in a setting. What impact did this have on their learning and their development? Have this in the back of your mind as we work through Unit 3.
The learning objectives for this Unit 3 on reasonable adjustments are, firstly, to learn what reasonable adjustments are and who they are for. We're also going to help you understand the legal underpinnings of reasonable adjustments, and we'll go through the 3 key requirements associated with them. We've also got a few activities scattered in the mix to help you consider how to apply reasonable adjustments in practical scenarios. This will encourage you to think about how you may implement what you've learned in your practice. We're going to start off this unit with a little warm-up activity we're going to do together. Please have a pen and paper at the ready. If you need to go find one, feel free to pause the recording. We're going to complete a dictation together, or in other words, write down on the piece of paper exactly what I say. However, a little bit different to a normal dictation, as you write, please replace any capital A or lowercase a with an @ sign, replace any lowercase e with a capital E, and any uppercase or lowercase s with a $sign. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, and in a moment we'll begin. So just to remind you, you're going to be writing down everything I say, but just changing those letters. Let's begin. Little Red Riding Hood often went for walks in the forest. Well done for completing round 1. We're going to do round 2 now, and the same activity applies. So as I speak, please write and replace any A or capital or lowercase with an @ sign, any lowercase e with a capital E, and any capital or lowercase s with a $sign. Okay, ready for round 2. One day, she went to visit her granny, who lived in the woods. One day, she went to visit her granny, who lived in the woods. So what did you think? Did it get easier, more challenging as time went on? Let's move on to another stage of the activity. Okay, now we're on to round 3. A little reminder in the box there, any capital A or lowercase a, please write as an @ sign. Any lowercase e, change to a capital E. Any capital S or lowercase s, change to a $sign. So same thing applies. I am going to read what's on the screen and you are going to write, but change the letters. Little Red Riding Hood met a wolf, and he said, "Where are you off to?" Little Red Riding Hood met a wolf, and he said, "Where are you off to?" Great job for completing round 3. How much easier was that, having the writing there on the slide to support you? Let's move on to round 4. Okay, now we're on to the final round, round 4. So again, one final reminder. Please change any capital A or lowercase a to an @ sign, any small e to a capital E, and any capital S or lowercase s to a $sign. Okay, we're going to begin now. She replied, I'm going to see my grandmother, who lives in that house by the trees. She replied, I'm going to see my grandmother, who lives in that house by the trees. So take a moment to pause and reflect. What were your thoughts on the exercise? Did it get easier? Maybe it got more challenging? Were there certain rounds that you found more straightforward than others? You may have found the task easier with the minor adjustments that were put in place. For example, when I read more slowly, when I repeated the sentence again, maybe when I pointed out the letters that required changing. Bear this in mind during this next unit. Just a couple of minor adjustments enabled you to carry out the activity more easily. And how may we apply that in our own practice? You may already be familiar with the term reasonable adjustments, and you may already be putting in place reasonable adjustments in your practice already for the children that you work with. But let's go back to basics and answer the question, what are reasonable adjustments? Where something a provider does might put disabled children at a substantial, which remember means more than minor or trivial, disadvantage compared with other children, providers must take reasonable steps to avoid that disadvantage. This is referred to as the reasonable adjustments duty. The duty is anticipatory, which means it requires providers to think ahead and consider what adjustments they may need to make so that disabled children can be included in the life of the provider as fully as possible. Providers can often avoid indirect discrimination and discrimination arising in consequence of a disability by thinking ahead, planning, and making reasonable adjustments. The reasonable adjustments duty includes 3 key requirements: to firstly make adjustments to provisions, criteria, or practices, to make adjustments to physical features, and thirdly, provide auxiliary aids and services. We are going to go through each of these different requirements in turn over the next few slides. These requirements apply differently in different providers. So early years settings that are not schools are required to meet all 3 of the requirements. Early years settings that are schools, including maintained nursery schools, are required to meet the 1st and 3rd requirements. Whilst the duty to alter physical features does not apply to schools, schools have accessibility planning duties that do not apply to other providers. For more information, see Unit 2. So let's take a closer look and go into more detail at the making adjustments to provisions, criteria, or practices requirement. When we talk about making adjustments in this way, what we mean is the way settings organise themselves, deploy resources, operate their policies, and also the day-to-day practices that they follow. So we've given some examples here. Parents, carers may be anxious about placing a young child in a group setting, so they're invited to carry out a risk assessment with the setting manager to consider what reasonable adjustments might need to be put in place. Just to flag that this is not a reasonable adjustment as such, but an example of good practice about working out what reasonable adjustments might be put in place in collaboration with that parent or carer. A second example is a setting or school uniform policy allows for the use of different fabrics and different types of clothing for a child who has certain medical needs. It's important to note that this uniform policy may not be relevant to all settings, but what children wear will impact on their ability to carry out those day-to-day activities. And finally, changing routine to accommodate a child's needs. So that might be if they need to take a certain medication or on a particular sleep cycle because of their disability. So it's so important to be flexible so as not to disadvantage that particular child. Can you think of any others? So let's look at the second one, which is making adjustments to physical features. And when we talk about this one, we mean elements of a building or environment that can be barriers to disabled individuals. These features can be part of the structure itself, the way it's been fitted out, or even how things are arranged inside. So again, we have some examples here, but important to mention that this isn't an exhaustive list. So you might make changes to the lighting or ventilation, and this may support an autistic child who's sensitive to lighting, for example. You may change the use of the rooms inside the building. You may want to convert a room into a sensory space, for example. You might use a different convenient level access entrance, or you may shift your rooms around to account for a wheelchair user or other aids. And finally, maybe rearranging or adapting furniture. You may need shift tables or play areas. Again, any more that you would add to this list? So let's take a look at that third requirement, which is providing auxiliary aids and services. This includes the provision of equipment, advice, or direct support to a disabled child. So again, we've included some examples. Some examples of aids could be visual aids to support children who have delayed cognitive processing. You might want to use large format storybooks to support some children. And you can make use of different communication systems. For example, picture exchange communication, or PECS for short. There may be particular toys and equipment that you can use for aids as well. As part of this requirement, advice and support may also be needed. So this could be getting advice from parents and ensuring that co-production is applied when putting in place reasonable adjustments in the setting. For those unfamiliar with the term co-production, this is about developing equal partnerships between the people who use services, i.e. the children using in the setting, and those who run them. By engaging closely with parent carers of disabled children from the beginning, on a basis of mutual respect, co-production can be used to overcome barriers, manage expectations, and solve complex problems. When successful, co-production leads to improved outcomes for both families and service providers by getting it right first time. Also important to bear in mind is you may need to draw on specialist expertise from the local authority services or wider. For example, early years inclusion advisors, the local sensory impairment service, hearing, visual impairment services, and many others. So now we're going to move on to using what we've learned and applying that to a practical scenario. So for this activity, I'd like you to reflect on the upcoming case study and consider these 4 questions. Number 1, do you think this child is disabled? Number 2, is the provider discriminating against the child based upon what you've learned in the previous units? Number 3, how could you go about identifying which reasonable adjustments are needed? And number 4, can you think of a similar situation you've been in and how did you approach that? So hopefully you've managed to memorize those 4 questions from the previous slide. Only joking, we've got them here on this slide to support you anyway. So let's have a look at the case study. A parent of a child who uses a standing frame for parts of the day has requested a place at a childminder. The childminder is keen to act inclusively, but thinks that it may be unsafe to let the child go in and out of the house, and it may be difficult for the child to play on some of the outdoor toys. So in a moment, pause the recording and think about the questions. Firstly, do you think this child is disabled? Number 2, is the provider discriminating against the child? Number 3, what reasonable adjustments might you put in place to ensure the disabled child is not at a disadvantage? And number 4, can you think of a similar situation you have been in? So pause the recording, have a conversation with your colleagues about the questions, or write a couple of notes that may reflect what you feel in relation to this case study. Welcome back, and hopefully you had a chance to have a good look at the case study and think about the 4 questions. We've set out some potential responses here in the slide, but just to bear in mind there may be multiple ways to approach this scenario. So number 1, do you think this child is disabled? Well, of course we 100% don't know if a child is disabled. That can only be decided by the tribunal. But likely yes, because the child requires a standing frame. This is likely to have substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, particularly if we apply the definition for young children. That is, by the time they reach 6, their impairment would have that substantial and long-term adverse effect on that ability to carry out the normal day-to-day activities. So in conclusion, likely yes. Number 2, is the provider discriminating against the child? Although it's really clear in the case study that the childminder is trying to act inclusively and has the child's safety in mind, if they did not put in place reasonable adjustments to enable the child to access the outdoor activities, this would place the child at a disadvantage in comparison to their peers. This could amount to discrimination. So let's have a look at that third question. We put our potential responses on the slide, but I'm sure there's some different ideas. So how could you go about identifying which reasonable adjustments are needed? Some of our examples. At an early visit, the childminder invites the parents to look at the question of access and at the outdoor toys that are available. Between them, the parents and the childminder, They assess the risks involved in getting up and down the steps to the outside area. They may consider which equipment might help the child by encouraging particular activities and which might present an unacceptable risk. The parents might seek views of an occupational therapist at their next visit, so getting that specialist expertise input. A co-produced plan is put in place so that the childminder knows which equipment they should be encouraged to use. So now that your brains have been worked by that case study activity, we wanted to share a really important principle that reasonable adjustments and adaptive anticipatory strategies for disabled children are often effective strategies to help all children to learn. If you think about examples like visual timetables, interest boxes, larger print storybooks, a child may not necessarily have a disability but will benefit from that learning approach. So do bear that in mind, that any reasonable adjustments you put in place may be having a wider impact than you may originally think. So now we're nearing the end of the unit, I wanted to reflect on the key takeaways. Reasonable adjustments fall into 3 key requirements: making adjustments to provisions, criteria or practices, making adjustments to physical features, and providing those auxiliary aids and services. There are some differences in application between settings and settings constituted as schools, namely that the requirement to make adjustments to physical features doesn't apply to settings that are constituted as schools, but instead they have school accessibility planning duties. The key point from this unit is that planning ahead is key to removing barriers to accessing education and ensuring children are not disadvantaged. Think about the case study. A reminder that although a reasonable adjustment is designed for an individual, most adjustments are of benefit to all children. And finally, positive discussions with families and children on what reasonable adjustments should be put in place are more likely to set you and the child up for success. So now we're at the end of this unit, we have a takeaway activity for you. Please watch this video about reasonable adjustments alongside your colleagues. Just to note, the reasonable adjustments shared in this video are for school-aged children and young people. It's included because it enables you to hear from the children themselves about the difference adjustments can make. Of course, reasonable adjustments will look different in early years providers to schools, but the principle remains the same. And excitingly, you can take the school lens and think about it from an early years perspective. If you asked a child in your setting, what might they say? So some of the questions we'd like you to consider are: what reasonable adjustments did you see in the video? You might want to make a list. What difference did the adjustments make to the children and their ability to participate? And can you draw any parallels in your setting? Any adjustments that could make a significant difference for a disabled child in your care? You can find the link to this video in the notes, and do feel free to share any reflections you have. Has this topic on reasonable adjustments piqued your interest, and are you wanting to learn more? If so, alongside this training we have developed the Equality Act Guide for Early Years, which is called Disabled Children and the Equality Act 2010, what early years providers need to know and do. It was published with this training in July 2025 by the Council for Disabled Children alongside the Department for Education. It provides detailed information on what early years providers need to know and do in relation to the Equality Act duties. This training has been informed by the guide. The link can be found in the notes.
You reached the end of this unit. Thank you for taking the time. Understanding these duties under the Equality Act is an important step in making sure disabled children aren't at a disadvantage in the setting. Before you move on, take a few minutes to complete the takeaway activity. It's there to help you think through what this means in your role, what might need to change in the way that things are done. When we get this right for disabled children, it often leads to stronger, more inclusive practice for everyone. Thanks again for joining.